Grenfell Tower, the disaster they were warned about. Imagine living in a tower block and feeling like something is not right. You complain, you warn people, you ask questions, you try to get the people in charge to listen. Then the worst thing happens. On the 14th of June 2017, 72 people died at Grenfell Tower. And what makes this even harder to accept is that Grenfell was not just a fire that came out of nowhere. The public inquiry later exposed dangerous materials, weak oversight, corporate dishonesty, government failure, and a council and tenant management body that failed to listen properly to the people living in the tower. And even after the fire, when survivors were promised new homes quickly, many were left waiting, chasing phone calls, and trying to rebuild their lives through bureaucracy. So this is not a video to sensationalize a tragedy. This is a Firefly Files investigation into a simple question. What happens when ordinary people warn the system, and the system does not listen? This was a community tragedy. Before we talk about blame, responsibility, councils, companies, or cladding, we have to start with the people. 72 people lost their lives. Families lost children, parents, grandparents, friends, and neighbors. People lost their homes, their safety, and their trust in the institutions that were supposed to protect them. So the tone of this video has to stay respectful. Grenfell is not a mystery to turn into entertainment. It is a real community tragedy. But being respectful does not mean being quiet, because the official record is clear. This disaster was preventable. It was not just bad luck. It was not just one faulty appliance. It was not just one bad night. It was the result of warnings, decisions, failures, and delays that built up over time. So the real question is not just what happened at Grenfell Tower. The deeper question is, why were people left in danger, and why did survivors still have to fight for help after everything they had already been through? A flat fire became a tower fire. The fire began in flat 16 on the 4th floor, shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning. In a high-rise block, a fire in one flat is supposed to stay contained for a period of time. That basic idea is called compartmentation. In simple terms, the building should give firefighters time to deal with the fire before it spreads. But at Grenfell, that did not happen. The fire escaped from the flat and reached the outside of the building. And once it got into the external wall system, the situation changed completely. The flames moved up the tower, down the tower, and around the tower. People who believed they were inside a building designed to contain fire were suddenly inside a building where the outside had become part of the danger. That is why Grenfell cannot be reduced to one fridge, one flat, or one moment. The fire may have started in a flat, but the catastrophe was made possible by what had been put on the building. The outside became fuel. A lot of people describe Grenfell as a cladding disaster. That is not wrong, but it is too simple. The inquiry looked at the whole outside wall system, the panels, the insulation, the gaps behind them, the window surrounds, the design, the installation, the testing, and the checks. The key point is this. The aluminium composite panels used on Grenfell had polyethylene cores. The inquiry found those panels were the principal reason the fire spread so quickly. The insulation behind the panels also helped the fire grow and travel. Put simply, the tower had been refurbished in a way that gave fire a route around the building. And that is the disturbing part. The outside of the tower was not just decoration, it became part of the fire. So when people ask why the fire spread so fast, the answer is not only about what happened inside flat 16. It is about the building system wrapped around homes where hundreds of people were living. A makeover became a danger. Grenfell Tower was part of the Lancaster West Estate in North Kensington. It was social housing in one of the richest boroughs in Britain. Before the fire, the tower had been refurbished. On the surface, that sounds positive. New exterior, new windows, a building made to look better. But this is where the story turns. A refurbishment is not just about appearance. It is about choices. What materials are used? Who checks them? Who signs off the design? Who asks whether this is safe for a high-rise block full of residents? The inquiry did not describe Grenfell as one simple mistake. It described a broken chain involving contractors, designers, suppliers, building control, regulation, and client oversight. And that is what makes it so frightening. This did not happen outside the system. It passed through the system. It went through meetings, documents, approvals, and sign-offs. The tower was made to look better from the outside, but the people inside were not protected. RBKC owned it. KCTMO managed it. Grenfell Tower was owned by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, known as RBKC. Day to day, the building was managed by the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organization, known as KCTMO. That matters because these were not distant names on paper. They were the bodies closest to the residents. They had responsibilities for the building, maintenance, resident communication, and fire safety management. The council also had building control responsibilities around whether the completed refurbishment met building regulations. And this is where the Firefly Files angle becomes clear. In one of Britain's wealthiest boroughs, social housing residents were raising concerns. But the people with power did not respond with the urgency and respect those residents deserved. That is the imbalance at the center of this story. Residents lived with the risk. The council and the TMO had the power. But too often, the people living inside the building were treated like complaints to manage, not warnings to act on. Residents were not silent. One of the hardest things about Grenfell is this. Residents were not silent. People raised concerns about safety, building work, power issues, access, management, and fire risk. The Grenfell Action Group repeatedly warned that something serious could happen. And when you think about it, residents are often the first people to know when a building is not right. They know the broken doors, they know the power problems, they know the smoke, the smells, the leaks, the delays, the things that do not feel safe. A good housing system would treat those warnings as valuable information. But the public record shows residents were too often not listened to, not respected, and not given the information they needed. That is the council neglect angle. It is not just one missed email. It is a wider culture where warnings from below did not move the people above quickly enough. And when warnings are treated like noise, danger starts to feel normal. A wealthy council failed basic duties. This is where we have to be sharp but careful. You do not need to exaggerate Grenfell to make it shocking. The facts are already strong enough. RBKC was a wealthy council. And in response to the inquiry, the council accepted that it failed to keep residents safe, failed to listen to and act on concerns, and failed to respond effectively when disaster struck. That is not a small admission. The government response also says Grenfell residents were not treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. Their homes were not safe. Their voices were not properly heard. So instead of just throwing around words, say it plainly, this was institutional neglect. Paperwork, power, defensiveness, and cost-conscious decision-making sat above the voices of people living inside the risk. And when the people with the least power are the ones carrying the most danger, something is deeply wrong with the system. Profit protected, people exposed. The council is central to this video, but Grenfell was bigger than the council. The inquiry also exposed serious dishonesty in parts of the construction products industry. Arconic made the ACM panels used on Grenfell. The inquiry found the company concealed dangers connected to the product, especially when used in cassette form on high-rise buildings. Celotex made the main insulation used on Grenfell, and the inquiry found it misled the market about the product's suitability. Kingspan's K15 was only present in small quantities at Grenfell, but the inquiry also criticized its marketing and testing history. This is where the greed part of the story comes in, but it should stay grounded. The point is not just to sound angry. The point is to show what happened. Products were sold, reputations were protected, and the people living behind those products carried the risk. Profit and image were protected more aggressively than residents were. Everyone had a role. Nobody stopped it. Grenfell shows how systems can fail when responsibility is spread across too many places. The inquiry criticized manufacturers, contractors, architects, fire safety professionals, certification bodies, regulators, government, the London Fire Brigade, the Council, and the TMO. That does not make the story less clear. It makes it more serious. Because when everyone has a part to play, someone still has to stop the danger before it reaches people. At Grenfell, nobody stopped it. A dangerous refurbishment moved through normal channels: tenders, documents, approvals, certificates, meetings, and sign-offs. And when the worst happened, each part of the system had its own role, its own excuse, its own failure. But for residents, it was not a chain of paperwork. It was their home. The rehousing promise sounded simple. After the fire, the promises came quickly. In Parliament, ministers said survivors who lost their homes would be offered temporary housing within 3 weeks, while permanent accommodation was found. But this is where we have to separate a promise from reality. An offer is not the same as being settled. Temporary accommodation is not recovery, and a hotel room is not a home. For many survivors, the period after Grenfell meant waiting, chasing, explaining themselves again and again, and trying to rebuild life without stability. That matters because the neglect did not end when the flames went out. People who had already been failed by unsafe housing were then pushed into another housing system that moved too slowly. And when someone has lost their home, their neighbors, their possessions, and their sense of safety, making them fight bureaucracy is another layer of harm. 1 year later, most were not permanently rehoused. Let the numbers sit for a moment. By June 2018, 1 year after the fire, Full Fact reported that 83 of 203 households from Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk were living in a permanent home. 52 were in temporary accommodation. 68 were still in emergency accommodation, including hotels, serviced apartments, or staying with family and friends. So 1 year after people had lost everything, the majority were still not permanently rehoused. Later, more people did move into permanent accommodation. And today, RBKC says most bereaved people and survivors have moved into permanent homes, while a small number are still yet to move. So the point is not to pretend nothing changed. The point is that the early delay was real. And for survivors, time matters. Every extra week in limbo is another week where life cannot properly restart. The response felt cold and chaotic. The aftermath is painful because it shows how a disaster response can fail people emotionally, not just practically. The inquiry's Volume 7 described emergency accommodation for some residents as haphazard. Some people struggled to get help. Some had to call repeatedly. Some were sent into systems that felt formal, confusing, and cold. The Westway Center was meant to be a support hub, but many accounts describe poor organization, unclear signposting, and a lack of warmth and privacy. And after something like Grenfell, support is not just about forms and rooms. It is about dignity. It is about someone reaching out before survivors have to beg for help. It is about understanding that people are traumatized, not just inconvenienced. At Grenfell, the community often provided that humanity better than the authorities. That is why the aftermath matters. It shows a second failure, not just unsafe homes before the fire, but inadequate care after it. North Kensington stepped in. One thing that should be remembered is the strength of North Kensington. Neighbors, volunteers, mosques, churches, community centers, local charities, and ordinary people moved quickly. They collected donations, they organized supplies, they supported families. They became trusted points of contact when official systems felt distant or confusing. That community response was powerful, but it also exposed the weakness of the official response. People closest to the community understood the community best. They knew the languages, the families, the fears, and the trust that had already been broken. So this section should not turn the disaster into a feel-good story. Say it plainly. The community showed humanity, but it should never have had to carry the weight of official failure. When institutions fail, ordinary people often step in. Grenfell showed that, but it should never be used as an excuse for the institutions that failed in the first place. The inquiry said it was preventable. In 2024, the Grenfell Tower Inquiry published its Phase 2 report. The message was clear. This tragedy was preventable. The 2026 Government Annual Report says the failures of public bodies, industry, and regulators should never have occurred, and that the tragedy should have been prevented. But we also have to be legally careful here. Inquiry findings are not the same as criminal convictions. Do not say people are criminally guilty unless a court says so. As of the Met Police update on May 19th, 2026, the investigation was on track to submit all charging files to the Crown Prosecution Service by the end of September 2026. The Met said 57 people and 20 organizations were suspects for criminal offenses, and the CPS expected to make charging decisions before the 10th anniversary in June 2027. For the families and survivors, that means the wait for legal accountability is still not over. And that is why Grenfell is not just history. It is still an open demand for justice. This is about how neglect becomes normal. For Firefly Files, Grenfell fits because it is not only about one event. It is about how neglect becomes normal. Residents warn, officials manage the complaints, documents move around, meetings happen, costs are discussed, but the danger remains. And that pattern appears in many stories. Companies failing, public bodies failing, vulnerable people being ignored, institutions protecting themselves until the consequences are too big to hide. Here, the consequence was catastrophic. A wealthy council failed social housing residents. Companies misled the market. Regulators and government failed to protect people. And after the fire, survivors still had to fight for stability. That is why the subject is powerful for the channel. It has a moral center, it has a factual base, and it has a reason for viewers to care beyond the headline, because safe housing should not depend on how much power you have. Grenfell was evidence. End this quietly, but firmly. Grenfell should never be remembered only as a tragedy. It should also be remembered as evidence. Evidence of what happens when residents are not listened to. Evidence of what happens when safety becomes paperwork. Evidence of what happens when profit, cost control, and reputation come before human life. The families and survivors have had reports, apologies, recommendations, and promises, but accountability has to match the scale of the loss. So the final message is this: Grenfell was not just a fire, it was a warning ignored. And if Britain says it has learned from Grenfell, then social housing residents must be heard before disaster proves them right. Because a safe home should never depend on how much money you have, how much power you have, or whether the council chooses to listen. So now I want to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.